Long before the United States existed on any map, 13 fragile colonies clung to the eastern edge of a vast and untamed continent. Their towns little more than clusters of wooden houses, their fields worked by men and women who had crossed an ocean seeking freedom, only to find themselves ruled by a king 3,000 miles away who treated them as little more than a distant piggy bank. It was the 1760s, and Britain, exhausted and bankrupt after the 7 Years' War, looked across the Atlantic and decided that the Americans should pay for an empire they had barely asked to join. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first thunderclap. Every newspaper, every legal document, every playing card now carried a hated tax stamp. Printers were thrown into jail, courthouses were mobbed, and in the streets of Boston, men began calling themselves Sons of Liberty. The act was repealed, but Britain doubled down with the townshend duties, taxes on glass, paint, paper, and tea. Colonial women organized boycotts, spinning their own cloth and drinking coffee made from burnt bread instead of British tea. Tensions boiled over on the snowy night of March 5, 1770, when a lone British sentry was taunted by a crowd. Reinforcements arrived, someone shouted, "Fire!" and 5 Bostonians lay dead in the snow. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent, became the first man to die for what would one day be called America. Paul Revere turned the massacre into a powerful engraving that flew from town to town, turning grief into fury. 3 years later, when Parliament granted the East India Company a monopoly and tried to force cheap but still taxed tea on the colonies, 3 shiploads arrived in Boston Harbor. On the moonless night of December 16, 1773, more than 100 men blackened their faces, donned Mohawk disguises, boarded the ships Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, and in 3 silent hours dumped 342 chests, 90,000 pounds of tea worth millions in today's money, into the dark water. King George III exploded with rage. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. Boston port closed until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts government stripped of self-rule. British officers accused of crimes to be tried in London, and redcoat soldiers quartered in private homes. The colonists had a simpler name for these laws: the Intolerable Acts. In September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered secretly in Philadelphia's Carpenters' Hall, the First Continental Congress, and agreed that if one colony was attacked, all would fight. Meanwhile, in villages across Massachusetts, farmers and blacksmiths were drilling on town greens, hiding muskets in haylofts, and casting lead balls in candle molds. On the night of April 18, 1775, British General Thomas Gage received orders to march on Concord and seize the colonial arsenal. But Dr. Joseph Warren had spies inside Boston. He sent Paul Revere and William Dawes racing westward with the alarm. Lanterns flashed from the steeple of the Old North Church, 2 if by sea, and Revere galloped past sleeping farms, shouting, "The regulars are out!" By dawn on April 19th, Captain John Parker and 77 Lexington Minutemen stood in tense silence on their village green. Major John Pitcairn's redcoats ordered them to disperse. Someone, perhaps a nervous militiaman, perhaps a British officer, pulled a trigger. A ragged volley followed. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans were dead or dying, only 1 redcoat scratched. The British marched on to Concord, found most of the weapons already moved, and at the North Bridge faced hundreds of arriving militia. This time, the farmers fired first. The redcoats broke and began a 17-mile running fight back to Boston, dropping dead and wounded along every stone wall and orchard. By nightfall, the roads were lined with scarlet bodies, and the war everyone had feared had finally begun. Within weeks, thousands of New England militia ringed Boston. On June 17, 1775, they fortified Breed's Hill under cover of darkness. The next morning, 2,400 British troops rowed across the harbor in perfect formation and marched up the hill in the blazing sun. Twice, the Americans let them come within yards before unleashing devastating volleys. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The third assault succeeded only because the colonists ran out of powder. The British took the hill, but lost 1,054 men, almost half their force. The myth of British invincibility was shattered forever. On July 3, 1775, a tall Virginia planter in a blue uniform coat rode into Cambridge and took command of what was now called the Continental Army. George Washington, a man who had never commanded more than 1,000 men in his life, now faced the might of the British Empire. For a year, the war seesawed. Boston was evacuated by the British in March 1776 after Washington dragged captured cannons to Dorchester Heights. But then came disaster. New York City fell. Long Island was a slaughter. Fort Washington and Fort Lee were lost. And by December, Washington's army had shrunk to barely 3,000 cold, hungry, half-naked men. Many enlistments were expiring. Some said the cause was finished. Then, on Christmas night, 1776, in a daring gamble that shocked the world, Washington led 2,400 men back across the ice-choked Delaware River in a howling storm and surprised the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn. 900 Germans surrendered with hardly a fight. A week later, he outmaneuvered Lord Cornwallis at Princeton. The revolution was suddenly alive again. In the summer of 1777, British General John Burgoyne launched a grand three-pronged invasion from Canada. One arm was destroyed at Bennington, another never arrived, and Burgoyne himself was surrounded in the forests near Saratoga. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men, the greatest British defeat since the Middle Ages. News of Saratoga reached Paris, and King Louis XVI, eager to revenge after the 7 Years' War, recognized American independence and sent fleets, armies, and millions in gold. The war became global. While Washington's men starved and froze at Valley Forge in the terrible winter of 1777-1778, learning to drill like professionals under Baron von Steuben, the British shifted strategy to the south, capturing Savannah and Charleston, believing Southern loyalists would flock to the crown. Some did, but thousands more took up arms against them in brutal guerrilla war. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens turned forests and swamps into killing grounds. In October 1780, at Kings Mountain, backcountry riflemen annihilated a loyalist force. The tide turned again. By 1781, Lord Cornwallis, frustrated in the Carolinas, marched north into Virginia, hoping to destroy American supply lines. Instead, he found himself cornered on the Yorktown Peninsula. Washington and French General Rochambeau marched south in secret. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sealed the Chesapeake, and for 3 weeks, American and French cannons pounded the British day and night. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his 8,000-man army. British bands played "The World Turned Upside Down" as redcoats laid down their arms. London was stunned. Prime Minister North cried, "Oh God, it's all over." Peace negotiations dragged on for 2 more years, but the fighting was finished. On September 3, 1783, in a quiet Paris hotel, British and American delegates signed the Treaty of Paris. Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from Canada to Florida. More than 25,000 Americans had died, 8,000 in battle, the rest from disease and hardship. Yet out of 8 years of sacrifice, betrayal, courage, and impossible hope, 13 quarreling colonies had forged themselves into one nation, the first in history to declare governments exist not by divine right, but by the consent of the governed. The first American war was over. The greatest experiment in human freedom had only just begun.
Subscribe our channel for next part, and don't forget to share with friends.